The moment the blast sent Connor Jansen sprawling across the dirt, he knew two things. One, his shoulder was definitely hit. Two, the aliens were going to make a bigger deal out of this than necessary. He gritted his teeth, rolling onto his side as the metallic scent of his own blood reached his nose. His armor had absorbed most of the impact, but a jagged tear across his upper arm oozed crimson. He pressed his gloved hand to it, feeling the warmth seep through his fingers. It hurt, but he'd had worse. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, rushed toward him. The towering form of Dr. Vayek, the Zortan field medic, loomed over him. The alien's four eyes widened, his grayish skin rippling in what Connor had come to recognize as alarm. "You are bleeding excessively," Vayek said, already pulling out a medical scanner. "Remain still." Connor exhaled sharply, shifting to sit up. "Relax, Doc. It's just a scratch." Vayek's eyes flicked to the blood-stained fabric of Connor's sleeve. "That is not a scratch. That is a wound. You humans and your absurd understatements." From the side, Lieutenant Orlane, another Zortan frilled tendrils along his jaw quivered, which Connor had learned meant irritation. "You require immediate stabilization," Orlane stated. "Why are you laughing?" Connor hadn't realized he was. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it was just the sheer contrast of their concern and his own assessment. He wiped the sweat from his brow with his uninjured arm. "Because I've had worse. It's not funny, I know, but you guys always react like I'm about to drop dead." Vayek had already pulled out a compression bandage, peeling away Connor's damaged sleeve with practiced efficiency. The alien's hands were surprisingly gentle despite their size. "Your biology is fragile. You should be unconscious from blood loss." Connor gave him a lopsided grin. "Guess I missed that memo." Before Vayek could respond, a warning blared through their communicators. The enemy wasn't done yet. Connor forced himself to his feet, ignoring the way the medic's eyes widened at his movement. "Jansen, you need to—" "No time," Connor interrupted. "We need to move." The battlefield was shifting, smoke curled through the air, and the distant sound of energy weapons discharging echoed through the valley. Their squad had fallen back toward a rocky ridge, using it for cover. Vayek hesitated, but then sighed in a way that suggested he had already given up trying to reason with Connor. "At least don't get shot again." No promises. They rushed toward the others, Connor keeping his injured arm close to his chest. It wasn't ideal, but he could still fire with his other hand if needed. The enemy forces, a group of insurgents using stolen tech, were recalibrating their positions. Sergeant Hale, a fellow human, shouted over the comms. "Jansen, you good?" "Fantastic," Connor replied. Hale snorted. "You're bleeding." Minor detail. The Zortans clearly disagreed, because Vayek muttered something in his native tongue that was probably not polite. They reached the squad's temporary cover, and Connor took a knee behind a boulder, his breath steadying. He could feel the throbbing in his arm, but it wasn't enough to slow him down. Orlane crouched beside him, scanning the terrain. "We need to flush them out." Connor nodded, already checking his rifle. "I can draw their fire." Vayek's tendrils twitched. "You are injured." "Yeah, but I can still run." Hale groaned. "Here we go again." Connor grinned. "It's a solid plan." Orlane considered it for a moment before sighing. "Your reckless nature is frustratingly effective." "I'll take that as a compliment." Before anyone could argue further, he darted from cover, drawing enemy fire instantly. Shots sizzled past him, but he kept moving, forcing their opponents to reveal their positions. It gave his squad the opening they needed. Within minutes, the tide shifted. The insurgents, now exposed, scrambled to retreat. The squad pressed forward, securing the area. As the dust settled, Connor let himself sag against a rock, finally acknowledging the burning pain in his arm. Vayek was on him in seconds. "Remove your armor. Now." The medic's tone left no room for argument. Connor sighed but complied. As the armor plating was peeled away, Vayek inspected the wound with a deep frown. "You tore the tissue further. You require proper treatment immediately." Connor winced as the alien applied a numbing agent. "I'll live." Vayek didn't look convinced. "I do not understand how your species survives itself." Connor chuckled, letting his head rest back against the rock. Sheer stubbornness, mostly. Vayek shook his head but continued his work, muttering under his breath. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion set in. He knew he'd need proper medical attention soon, but for now he was still in one piece. And that was good enough. Connor sat on the edge of the medical bay's cot, arm newly bandaged, watching Vayek catalog a tray of instruments with the kind of meticulous care only a Zortan could maintain for such a mundane task. The ship hummed around them, the rhythmic thrum of its engines steady beneath his boots. They were back in orbit, on their way to debrief, but Vayek had insisted on a full evaluation before releasing him. "You are still losing a small amount of blood," Vayek muttered, adjusting the scanner over Connor's arm. "It is unacceptable." Connor flexed his fingers experimentally. "It's not a big deal." The scanner beeped, and Vayek's frilled tendrils stiffened. "Your blood pressure disagrees." Connor sighed, leaning back against the cot's thin cushion. "Look, I've been banged up worse before. This'll heal in a few days." Vayek's eyes flicked from the scanner to him, disbelief evident. "You speak as if your own durability is an inconvenience rather than a biological anomaly." Connor chuckled. "I mean, kinda." The door slid open and Orlane entered, his uniform crisp despite the chaos of the last mission. He glanced at Connor, then at Vayek. "Is he stable?" Vayek gestured toward Connor with the scanner. "By human standards, yes. By any reasonable metric, no." Connor grinned. "I'm fine." Orlane ignored that. "The debrief begins in 20 minutes. Can he attend?" Vayek exhaled sharply through his nostrils. "Against my recommendation, certainly." Connor swung his legs off the cot. "Great, let's go." Vayek caught his arm before he could stand. "You will hydrate, now." Connor rolled his eyes but accepted the bottle placed in his hand. "Happy?" Vayek did not look happy. Orlane motioned toward the door. "We are expected." They left the medical bay, Connor adjusting his uniform sleeve over the fresh bandage as they walked. The corridors of the ship were sleek, utilitarian, the overhead lights casting a cool glow. Other personnel moved past them, some Zortan, some human, all moving with the quiet efficiency of a ship fresh from combat. They reached the briefing room where Sergeant Hale and Commander Drennick, the Zortan overseeing their unit, were already seated. The commander's imposing frame made the chair look slightly too small, his dark eyes assessing Connor the moment he stepped inside. "You are injured," Drennick observed. Connor shrugged. "Nothing serious." Drennick tapped his fingers against the table. "Your reckless maneuver exposed the enemy's position." Connor nodded. "That was the idea." Hale crossed his arms. "And nearly got yourself shot twice for the trouble." Connor grinned. "But I didn't." Drennick studied him for a long moment before turning his attention to Orlane. "Casualty?" "Minimal," Orlane said. "The enemy was forced to retreat. However, their equipment suggests additional forces elsewhere." Drennick nodded slowly. "We will need further reconnaissance." Hale leaned forward. "You think they've got more stolen tech stashed off-world?" "Unlikely they would risk open conflict if this was their only supply," Orlane stated. Drennick glanced at Connor again. "Your injury will not impair performance?" Connor shook his head. "I'll be ready." Vayek, standing near the door, made a disapproving noise. Drennick didn't seem convinced, but didn't argue. "We will prepare for deployment in 48 hours. Dismissed." As they exited the room, Hale fell into step beside Connor. "You need rest." Connor smirked. "I'll sleep when I'm dead." Hale rolled his eyes. "You know, that attitude is why the aliens think we're insane." Connor clapped him on the back. "Then we're doing something right." Vayek, walking just behind them, muttered something in Zortani that Connor was fairly certain translated to "reckless fools." Connor just laughed. Connor woke to the rhythmic hum of the ship's ventilation system and the distant murmur of personnel moving through the corridors. His arm throbbed beneath the fresh bandages, but it was a dull ache now, nothing sharp or urgent. He flexed his fingers experimentally, testing the range of motion. Stiff, but functional. He'd take it. Vayek stood at the foot of the cot, arms crossed, watching him with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for malfunctioning equipment. "You should still be resting," Vayek said. Connor rubbed the sleep from his face. "I did rest. For 4 hours. Plenty." Vayek exhaled sharply through his nostrils. Humans have an alarming disregard for their own well-being. Connor swung his legs over the side, testing his balance. "We just bounce back fast." Vayek's tendrils twitched. "That is not how biology works." Connor shrugged, pushing himself to his feet. "Works for me." The doors slid open before Vayek could argue further, revealing Orlane. The Zortan lieutenant took one look at Connor and let out a resigned sigh. "He is already moving?" Vayek gestured toward Connor with both hands. "Against all logic, yes." Orlane's gaze lingered on the bandaged arm before shifting to Vayek. "The commander has requested our presence in the hangar." Vayek muttered something in Zortani before turning back to Connor. "If you tear the wound open again, I will sedate you." Connor grinned. "Noted." They left the medical bay, moving through the winding corridors of the ship. The scent of sterilized metal and recycled air filled the space, punctuated by the occasional whir of maintenance drones gliding along the walls. When they reached the hangar, the sight waiting for them made Connor pause. 2 sleek, unfamiliar ships occupied the docking space, their hulls marked with insignias he didn't recognize. Around them, engineers and security personnel worked in tandem, scanning equipment and ensuring everything remained contained. Drennick stood near the central console, conversing with a figure clad in dark, intricate armor. Their helmet obscured their features, but the rigid posture suggested authority. Orlane stepped forward first. "Unexpected visitors?" Drennick glanced at them before motioning toward the armored figure. "A delegation from the Von Dominion. They claim to have intelligence on the insurgents." Connor folded his arms. "That doesn't sound suspicious at all." The armored figure turned toward him, voice modulated through their helmet. "We have no interest in deception, only results." Connor arched a brow. "Right, because anonymous figures showing up unannounced always have good intentions." Drennick shot him a warning look, but the Varn representative remained unfazed. "The insurgents you encountered were not acting alone," the figure continued. "They have acquired something dangerous. If left unchecked, it will destabilize more than just your conflict." Orlane's frills quivered slightly. "Clarify." The representative tapped a small device on their wrist, projecting a holographic image into the air. It displayed a fragmented data set, full of incomplete readings and distorted visuals. One frame caught Connor's attention. A storage facility, its walls lined with containment units. Inside one of them, something pulsed with an eerie blue glow. Drennick's gaze darkened. "What is that?" The Varn hesitated. "A biological weapon. One designed to adapt to its host." Connor tensed. "And the insurgents have this?" "They have something derived from it," the Varn corrected. "If they succeed in weaponizing it fully, your resilience will not save you." Vayek frowned. "You speak as if you have encountered it before." The representative's silence was telling. Drennick considered the projection for a moment before addressing Orlane. "Prepare a strike team. We need to locate their facility before they escalate further." Connor straightened. "I'm coming." Vayek turned on him immediately. "No, you are not." Connor gestured toward his arm. "I'm fine." "You are reckless," Vayek countered. "And injured." Orlane interjected before the argument could escalate. "We may need his adaptability." Vayek looked deeply displeased, but didn't argue further. Drennick glanced between them. "We leave in 6 hours. Be ready." As the group dispersed, Connor turned to Vayek. "See? I'm useful." Vayek shook his head. "You are an anomaly." Connor grinned. "I'll take it." The landing was rough. The shuttle jolted violently as it cut through the thick atmosphere, turbulence rattling through the hull. Connor gripped the overhead strap, unaffected by the jarring descent. Across from him, Orlane braced against the wall, his expression unreadable. Vayek, secured into one of the reinforced seats, looked about as thrilled as ever to be accompanying them on a mission that, in his words, was unreasonably hazardous. Drennick's voice crackled over the comms. Deploying in 20 seconds. Expect resistance. Connor checked his rifle, ensuring the charge was full. They know we're coming? They will soon, Orlane said. The ramp lowered, and the heat from the planet's surface hit like a wall. The facility loomed ahead, a skeletal structure of rusted metal and reinforced barriers, half buried in the sand. It was built for secrecy, but the faint hum of energy shields suggested it was still in operation. Connor moved first, boots sinking slightly into the ground as he pushed forward. Orlane and the others followed, weapons raised. The air smelled of scorched minerals, the distant wind carrying the faint crackle of static from the shields. Vaic was scanning the perimeter with a handheld device, his tendrils shifting in agitation. Radiation levels are higher than expected. Minimal but prolonged exposure is inadvisable. Noted, Connor said, already moving toward the facility's main entrance. Let's not stick around longer than necessary. The first shot came from the left. Connor barely had time to duck before a bolt of plasma sizzled past his head, striking the metal panel behind him. He dropped to one knee, returning fire instinctively. The insurgents were dug in, positioned behind makeshift barricades. Orlane took cover beside him, scanning their defenses. They were prepared. Connor exhaled sharply. Nothing we can't handle. Vaic, positioned behind a piece of debris, muttered something in Zortani that Connor was certain wasn't complimentary. They advanced in bursts, covering each other as they moved. The insurgents were well armed but disorganized, their shots scattered and panicked. Connor reached the first barricade, vaulting over it before the enemy could react. The closest insurgent tried to bring his weapon up, but Connor drove his elbow into the man's chest, knocking him to the ground. Orlane dispatched another, his movements precise. The rest of the squad pushed forward, forcing the remaining insurgents to fall back toward the facility. Vaic approached cautiously, scanning one of the downed enemies. Their vitals are erratic. They are exhibiting signs of biological interference. Connor wiped sweat from his brow. The weapon? Orlane examined the nearest body. The insurgent's skin was pale, almost translucent in some areas, veins darkened unnaturally. It would seem so. Drennick's voice came through the comms. Report. Orlane responded immediately. Enemy forces are compromised. Signs of biological tampering. Drennick was silent for a moment. Then, proceed with caution. Connor checked the nearest doorway. The locking mechanism was old but reinforced. We need to get inside. Vaic examined the panel. I can override it, but it will take time. Connor glanced back at the battlefield. The insurgents that had fallen weren't moving, but something about the stillness felt wrong. He tightened his grip on his weapon. Make it fast. Vaic worked quickly, fingers moving over the controls with practiced efficiency. The lock released with a sharp hiss. Connor stepped inside first, rifle raised. The interior was dimly lit, the corridors narrow and lined with exposed wiring. The air was thick with an unnatural humidity, the scent metallic and stale. Orlane moved beside him, scanning ahead. There is interference in the readings. Something is disrupting standard signals. Connor pressed forward, heart pounding. The deeper they moved, the more evident it became that this facility wasn't just a hideout. It was a laboratory. Glass chambers lined the walls, some shattered, others still humming with energy. Inside the intact ones, indistinct shapes pulsed faintly. Vaic examined the nearest container. This is not conventional technology. Connor didn't need the clarification. Whatever was inside those chambers wasn't normal. A sound echoed from deeper within the corridor, a low, unnatural clicking. Orlane raised his weapon. We are not alone. Connor exhaled slowly. Of course we're not. They moved carefully, boots silent against the grated floor. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, where a central console flickered erratically. The room was littered with overturned equipment, the walls streaked with something dark. Vaic knelt near one of the consoles, scanning the data. Some of these logs are corrupted, but it appears they were attempting controlled experimentation. Connor didn't like the way he said attempting. Before he could respond, motion from the far side of the room caught his attention. One of the insurgents, barely standing, stumbled forward. His breathing was ragged, his eyes unfocused. Vayek stepped forward cautiously. He is in distress. The insurgent's body convulsed suddenly, and Connor barely had time to react before the man collapsed entirely, his limbs twitching violently. Orlane pulled Vayek back as the body spasmed unnaturally. The man let out a strangled breath, then went still. The silence that followed was heavier than any firefight. Connor scanned the room again, every muscle tense. "We need to destroy this place." Orlane nodded, agreed. Vayek looked at the fallen insurgent, then at the remaining chambers. If this spreads beyond containment, the consequences will be catastrophic. Connor set his jaw. "Then we make sure it does." Drennick's voice came through the comms again. "Status?" Connor responded immediately. "We found the source. It's worse than expected." Drennick was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do what must be done." Connor glanced at Vayek. "Can you rig the generators to overload?" Vayek hesitated, then nodded. "It will take time. Then we hold this position," Orlane said. Connor took a steadying breath, gripping his rifle as the faint clicking sound echoed again, this time closer. Whatever was left in this facility wasn't human anymore, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The first shape moved in the dim light, emerging from the corridor beyond the central console. Connor raised his rifle, pulse steady, as a second figure followed, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their uniforms were torn, skin pallid, veins darkened with an eerie discoloration. Orlane didn't hesitate, firing a single, precise shot into the closest insurgent's chest. The body absorbed the impact but barely reacted, staggering forward as if the injury was inconsequential. Connor didn't wait for a response. He adjusted his aim and fired at the insurgent's knee. This time the body crumpled, collapsing under its weight. The second figure lunged, and Orlane met it with a clean strike across the head, sending it sprawling. Vayek was already working at the control panel, fingers flying across the interface. Sparks showered as he bypassed the security protocols, his tendrils twitching in frustration. "The system is resisting override. I need more time." Connor kept his rifle trained on the corridor. "How much?" 4 minutes. Orlane repositioned beside the entrance, scanning the shadows. "They are not operating under normal biological limits." Connor gestured toward the fallen insurgents. "No kidding." The facility trembled as something deeper within shifted. A deep, reverberating sound echoed through the walls, like metal groaning under strain. The air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural energy. Vayek muttered something in Zortani, not bothering to translate. Connor adjusted his grip. "Whatever's in here, it knows we're trying to shut it down." Orlane fired another round into the insurgent struggling to rise. This time, it stayed down. A new figure entered the threshold, different from the others. Taller, clad in armor reinforced with biomechanical plating. Its movements were fluid, controlled. Not an insurgent. Something else. Connor fired a burst at its torso. The rounds struck, but instead of stumbling, the figure absorbed the impact, its body shifting unnaturally to compensate. Then it moved. Fast. Orlane barely stepped aside in time as the creature lunged, striking where he had been a second earlier. The impact sent a dent into the metal wall. Connor switched tactics, sidestepping and aiming for the joints. The first shot struck its shoulder, forcing a slight recoil. The second, aimed at the knee, sent it staggering. Vayek's voice cut through the chaos. "System override successful, initiating overload." The entire facility shuddered as the power grid surged. Lights flickered and a low alarm droned through the corridors. Connor didn't look back. "We're done here. Move." Orlane covered their retreat, firing controlled bursts to keep the advancing figures at bay. Vayek was already ahead, sprinting toward the exit. The air crackled as the containment units in the lab began destabilizing. Connor caught a glimpse of the pulsing blue substance inside one of the chambers as it reacted violently to the power surge. Cracks spread across the reinforced glass. They reached the outer corridor just as the first explosion detonated behind them. The shockwave propelled heat outward, sending debris scattering. Connor kept running, lungs burning as they reached the shuttle bay. The ramp was already lowering, the pilot shouting for them to board. Fayek stumbled as another tremor rocked the ground, and Connor caught his arm, hauling him upright. "Not the time to fall apart, Doc." Fayek didn't argue, scrambling up the ramp as Orlane followed, still covering their rear. The moment they were inside, the shuttle lifted, engines roaring as they ascended. Below, the facility buckled, its structure collapsing inward as the overload reached critical levels. Connor slumped into a seat, chest heaving. His arm throbbed, but he ignored it, watching as the ground below erupted in a final, violent blast. Drennick's voice came through the comms. "Status?" Orlane answered first, still catching his breath. "Facility neutralized." Fayek sat heavily, glancing at Connor. "You are bleeding again." Connor looked down at his arm. The bandages were soaked through. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I'll survive." Fayek's tendrils twitched in exasperation. "One day, your recklessness will catch up to you." Connor grinned, leaning back against the seat. "Maybe, but not today." The shuttle carried them away, leaving the ruined facility behind. Whatever had been brewing down there was gone, wiped from existence before it could spread beyond control. No loose ends, no lingering threats, just another mission finished.